I just blew $200,000. My husband Dennis, who didn't even attend my mother Kristen's funeral, had flown abroad. $200K? How on earth did you manage that? You know that grand piano we had at home that wasn't being used? I sold that. Wow, to think it was such a good piano, being from a wealthy family and all. Never thought I could sell it for $200K. It seems Dennis mistakenly thought that the large grand piano at my parents' house was mine. My condolences. The inheritance rights to my family home are all mine. However, that piano was originally bought by my grandfather for my big brother Robert, and it still belongs to Robert. Robert has loved playing the piano since he was little and is now teaching the piano as a job. But Robert's house couldn't fit that piano, so it was kept at our parents' house. Given that Robert is a strongly possessive person, he would be furious to find out someone sold his piano without his consent, even if he hadn't used it for a long time. He is too strong-willed, a mere compensation wouldn't suffice. When I broke the news, Dennis immediately hung up the phone. My name is Charlotte. I'm a 45-year-old office worker. My family is of a distinguished lineage that is well known in this region. Thanks to my deceased father's successful business, we now possess assets that worth $9 million. Originally, it was planned that my elder brother, Robert, would inherit the house. However, Robert had a fiancée from a family just like ours who needed an heir. From the desperation of marrying her, Robert said he would forsake the inheritance in favor of not taking over the family home. Which left me with no choice. I had to preserve our family legacy. I wanted to be independent without relying on my family's wealth, so after graduating college, I joined a top-tier company. Focused solely on my career, I realized I was still single in my mid-40s. It was time to find someone, or the family line would end with me. Thus, I boldly attended a matchmaking party. There, I met my current husband. His name is Dennis, and he's a decade younger than me. Yet, at the party, he showed no interest in younger women and approached me first. Are you sure you're okay with someone older like me? I asked him repeatedly, but Dennis looked me straight in the eye and answered. I like mature, reliable women because I'm shy and a bit unreliable myself. True to his word, Dennis came across as a reserved, slightly introverted type. I thought he could bring some calmness to our strong-willed family. As our relationship began, there was something I knew I had to tell him. My mother, Kristen, had been bedridden since last year due to illness, and I was taking turns caring for her with my sister-in-law, Violet. I was wondering how to bring it up, since I wanted to consider marrying Dennis. I finally told him on our third date. He willingly agreed and even proposed at that moment, offering to help with the caregiving. I was touched by his kindness. Or that's what I thought at first. Dennis works at a nursery. However, 4 months into our marriage, he suddenly said he wanted to quit his job. When I asked why, he started explaining, looking guilty. I'm sorry, Charlotte. The child care center where I work has been receiving terrible complaints from parents. I just can't take it anymore. Surely, for someone as timid as Dennis, it must have been hard. Ideally, I would have encouraged him to keep trying, but I couldn't say anything to Dennis, knowing that he will also help with my mother's care. Plus, I'm now 3 months pregnant. For the sake of our unborn child, I want to make things work with Dennis. That's why I showed him kindness, but soon things took a turn which made me regret my decisions. As I was about to enter the bedroom after showering, I heard Dennis talking in a hushed voice on the phone. I was shocked by the conversation. I managed to get married without her realizing I'm unemployed. When I said I quit my job today, she totally believed me. I actually quit working 2 years ago. It sounded like Dennis was talking to a friend. A faint male voice was leaking from the other end of the phone. "You're quite the schemer, huh?" Of course, seeing Charlotte at the matchmaking party, I thought I hit the jackpot since her family is well known around here for being filthy rich. Though I was the only one who approached her because she's too old. I felt deceived. All of Dennis's kindness was just for show. I wanted to storm out and confront him, but thinking of the baby in my belly, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Knowing Dennis's true feelings, I lost confidence in our future together. Today, Violet was taking care of my mother until 5 p.m., and then I was supposed to take over in the evening. I wondered if I should talk to someone about Dennis. Then Violet spoke to me. "Charlotte, why the long face? If you have any worries, feel free to share them with me." Violet is a very kind person. Having cared for her own mother for years, she also takes great care of mine. I told Violet about Dennis. Violet listened to my story with a serious expression. "It's good that you talked about it. Keeping it all to yourself could have harmed the baby." "You're right. I'm sorry." "Don't worry, it's not something that can be resolved just by talking, but it helps to talk. But this is indeed troubling." Violet seemed to be racking her brains as if it were her own problem. Then, Dennis rang the doorbell, but he entered the house without waiting for our response anyways. Violet and I were a bit surprised, but Dennis just smiled without a care. "Charlotte, I'll start helping with Kristen's care from today. You're not yet in your stable period, so it wouldn't be right to overburden you." Dennis was playing the part of a docile man in front of me. "Is that so? Well, let me show you how things are done." "No, Violet will teach me." "Charlotte, you shouldn't strain yourself. Go home quickly and rest. Even so, Robert is coming home early today, so we need to let Violet go." As I said that, Violet looked at me, shook her head, and seemed to say, "It's okay." Perhaps Violet was planning to ask Dennis about the details after I left. I read her mind and I decided to leave the situation to Violet and go home. However, I couldn't help but worry, so I pretended to leave and hid quietly. Violet was about to speak to Dennis, but he spoke first. "I've been meaning to ask, why are you taking care of your mother-in-law in this house?" Dennis's tone was like how he was speaking on the phone. "Why?" "Because my husband is too busy to come, and Charlotte has work. Besides, why do you ask such a question?" Then Dennis said something terrible to Violet. "With a wealthy family like this, they could easily afford a care facility, right? Or what? Are you trying to curry favor by taking care of Kristen because your husband renounced the family wealth? I guess anyone would panic if they married into wealth but won't inherit anything." That's a terrible thing to say. I was furious at Dennis's cruel words and was about to leave. But Violet gave me a look that said, "Don't come out." Reluctantly, I could only watch them silently. "So that's it, huh? Then leave. The wealth of this house belongs to us, not you. I'll take care of my mother alone from now on." Realizing arguing was futile, Violet left. I quietly went outside, making sure Dennis doesn't notice my presence. Violet must have been deeply hurt. I wondered how I could ever apologize to her. And so, Dennis began taking care of my mother alone. Though I offered to help, Dennis insisted I stay away, so I just explained to him the basics of caregiving. However, Dennis's negligent care led to my mother's passing. Her funeral was held in a nearby church. But from the day my mother died, Dennis disappeared. I tried to look for him, but was overwhelmed with funeral preparations and other procedures. Relatives and neighbors also seemed puzzled that my husband was nowhere to be found. Violet was crying in front of the photograph of my mother, apologizing for having entrusted Dennis with the caregiving. I approached the sobbing Violet and tried to console her. "Violet, please don't be troubled. It's our fault as a couple." "No, Charlotte, you're not to blame." "But what about that man? I wanted to give him a piece of my mind today, but he disappeared as soon as Kristen died." "Exactly. And Dennis was off and out while he was supposed to be caregiving, wasn't he? Where on earth was he at?" According to the neighbors, Dennis seemed to be frequently leaving the house, which was hardly the behavior of someone caregiving, more like a jobless guy fooling around. And apparently a large truck was showing up at some point. What was that truck doing there? Though it intrigued me, I didn't mention it to anyone during the funeral. 3 days after the funeral, Dennis still hadn't returned. Then, I received a call from Dennis on my mobile phone. "Ah. Charlotte? I'm at this luxury hotel in Europe I saw on a travel show right now." Dennis's carefree voice came through. "What? What are you doing? Not even attending my mother's funeral?" I yelled, infuriated, and Dennis replied with something unexpected. "I just blew $200,000. $200K? How on earth did you manage that? You know that grand piano at home that wasn't being used? I sold that." "Wow, to think it was such a good piano, being from a wealthy family and all. Never thought it'd sell for $200K. Dennis had sold the grand piano from my family home and was using the money to gallivant across Europe. That piano was a treasured keepsake of my mother's from my grandfather, indeed worth around $200,000. The hotels Dennis booked were all very luxurious, quickly burning through the money. I never dreamed Dennis would do such a thing while supposedly caregiving for my mother. Our home has tight security, but family members are a different story. Was that truck there to haul away the piano? How could you do something so irresponsible? Everyone was worried about you not being at the funeral. Well, once the baby is born, I won't have much free time, right? Since you have a job, I'll have to be a house husband and take care of the child." I was dumbfounded by Dennis's words, forgetting my anger. It's great that he wants to take care of our child, but he seems to be planning to leech off me further. And Dennis seemed to have mistaken that grand piano for mine. I sarcastically told Dennis, enjoying his lavish lifestyle with the money from the grand piano sale. "My condolences." "Huh? What's that supposed to mean?" Dennis asked in a baffled tone, so I explained about the grand piano. "That piano was originally bought by my grandfather for Robert. So, it's still Robert's property." "Oh, I see. Don't scare me like that. I'll just apologize to Robert later and it should be fine, right?" Dennis seemed utterly unremorseful for selling someone else's property. Well, Dennis hasn't seen Robert since our wedding, so he doesn't know how intimidating Robert can be. Robert, a piano teacher. He has always loved pianos and pestered our grandfather to buy that specific one. Currently, his home doesn't have space for the piano, so it remained at our family home, which was still owned by Robert. Robert works at a piano school but plans to start his own using that piano eventually. Considering Robert's love for pianos, I wonder what kind of punishment he'll impose on Dennis. Robert is known for his strong personality and intolerance for dishonesty. As I explained all this, Dennis was completely silent. "Do you understand? If Robert finds out his precious grand piano was sold without his permission, mere compensation won't be enough. Robert is not only strong-willed but also uncompromising. I wonder what kind of punishment awaits you." As I spoke threateningly, the call suddenly ended. He must be feeling awkward and worrying about what he should do. I immediately called Robert and told him everything that had happened over the phone. Of course, Robert was furious. The next day, Dennis hurriedly returned home. As he entered through the front door, Dennis was surprised to see everyone gathered in the living room.
What? What's everyone doing here?
I had arranged for all our relatives to gather, anticipating Dennis's return. Of course, my brother and his wife were also present. Robert, with a menacing look, glared at Dennis and said,
Dennis, I've heard everything from Charlotte. What were you thinking? Selling someone else's property, especially something as valuable as that, without any consultation with the family?
Intimidated by Robert's stern tone, Dennis tentatively replied,
So, Robert, I was just getting bored with taking care of Kristen, thought I'd do some cleaning around the house. Then I saw that old, big grand piano and thought nobody was using it anymore. And you decided to sell it? I did. It seemed like a waste to just leave it there, didn't it?
Robert shook his head in disapproval at Dennis's feeble excuse.
I see. For your information, that was a piano our grandfather had specially ordered from a top European manufacturer, showing off. What did you do with the money?
Robert was indeed an actor. He must be well aware Dennis had spent it all on a trip abroad, but he was forcing Dennis to confess in front of everyone. Dennis was desperately trying to think of an excuse. He didn't respond immediately and seemed to be pondering.
Well, the proceeds, they haven't exactly come in yet.
As Dennis stammered out his excuse, Robert's anger finally erupted.
Lies! How corrupt can you be? And what about all those European souvenirs in that big suitcase?
Dennis, as if he was struck by lightning, flinched and closed his eyes.
I'm sorry. I spent all the money.
Dennis's confession caused a stir among the relatives. They all knew the value of that grand piano. The idea that he had blown $200K on a single trip abroad was unbelievable to them. Lifting Dennis's chin to make eye contact, Robert said,
Anyway, as you must have heard from Charlotte, that piano was mine. Since you've sold it, you'll have to fully compensate. If you can't, I'll have to charge you with theft. Are you okay with that?
Robert is assailing Dennis with overpowering presence. Robert was intimidating, like a mafia boss. Normally, suing over a family matter like this wouldn't happen. But Robert was probably threatening Dennis, who was oblivious to legal matters. As expected, Dennis was speechless and sweating profusely. Then, with a frightened voice, he looked at me.
Charlotte! Help me!
His pathetic plea for help was met with my firm rejection.
It's none of my business. It was all your doing.
But then Dennis began to say something outrageous.
Don't be so cold. I took care of your parent instead of you, who's pregnant. I thought of it as a reward for myself and went on the trip right after caregiving. So, let's say we sold the piano together as a couple. That way, as siblings, it won't be considered theft, right?
Excuse me? I was dumbfounded. But Violet came to my rescue.
Enough is enough. Didn't you tell Charlotte not to come for the caregiving? And you accused me of caring for Kristen only for the inheritance. What? Dennis, you said such awful things to Violet too?
Yes.
I didn't want to worry you, so I kept silent, sorry. But this man was planning to keep Charlotte and me away from the family home to secretly sell the piano.
With Violet's explanation, it made sense to me now, especially considering that Dennis had insisted on doing the caregiving alone, keeping me away from the family home. Robert's anger reached a peak with Dennis's elaborate scheme.
First of all, let me say this, Dennis. Violet took care of our mother because she refused to go into a facility. Violet, having cared for her own mother, kindly agreed to take on our mother's care. Money is secondary. Apologize to Violet right here, right now. Ah.
As Robert grabbed him by the collar, Dennis knelt in front of Violet and deeply apologized, with tears in his eyes. Violet, I'm so sorry. Even though Dennis apologized for his disrespectful behavior towards Violet, all the relatives around him looked at him with disdain. Then, one of the relatives, Uncle Morris, shouted at Dennis.
Anyway, pay back the piano sales proceeds as soon as possible. We can't have a criminal coming from our family.
Dennis misunderstood Uncle Morris somehow, and he made another odd statement.
Right? We can't have a criminal, Robert. So, let's settle this calmly. We'll save up the money as a couple and pay you back little by little.
Morris was taken aback by Dennis's bizarre interpretation and didn't bother to respond, realizing talking further would solve nothing. So I went to my room to get something. The divorce papers I had prepared since the phone call Dennis had with his friend. Dennis, please sign this. I want our relationship to be over with this. Seeing the divorce papers I handed over, Dennis's face turned pale.
Why? We're about to have a child, aren't we? Why would you do this?
I then shared the content of Dennis's phone conversation with his friend in front of all the relatives. What? You heard that? That was obviously a joke. Do you really think such an excuse will work? I know you approached me for my money from the beginning. Everyone around glared at Dennis with anger. Realizing he couldn't escape the situation, Dennis defiantly responded. I was so close to get my hands on $9 million. I looked up how much wealth Kristen left for you after we got married. Everyone was shocked by Dennis's sudden change, revealing his true colors. Perhaps I should have been more cautious about a man I met at a matchmaking party who was a decade younger than me. Believing we married for love, this betrayal deeply wounded me. I demanded compensation from Dennis as restitution. Since Dennis would become a stranger to Robert and everyone else, he naturally had to compensate for the grand piano as well. Dennis broke down crying, saying it's impossible. But with all the relatives as witnesses, he couldn't run away. Don't worry, though. I won't ask for child support.
Really? Well, I guess that's some consolation. But in return, Dennis, you will have no involvement with this child. This child is mine alone. You're not allowed to call yourself the parent.
I firmly stated, placing my hand on my belly. Are you serious? Won't I even get to see the child's face? Well, obviously yes. Someone who deceives people for money doesn't deserve to be a father. As I said this, Dennis collapsed to the ground with a sad look on his face. Since the divorce, Dennis had fallen into poverty, working live-in jobs. One day, Dennis called me. I didn't want to interact with him, but after he kept calling multiple times, I reluctantly answered. Charlotte, I need your help. Dennis's voice was pathetic as he begged for help. Apparently, the buyer of the grand piano he sold wanted to return it and demanded his money back. When Dennis put the piano on sale, he had claimed it was an old item but without a single scratch. However, the piano had a large engraving of Robert's name on the backside, done by Robert himself, declaring,
"This is mine, nobody else touch it."
Dennis probably hadn't checked the back. Even so, if he had sold it through a reputable piano buyer, they would have checked thoroughly. It seems he chose a sketchy dealer. He was likely lured by promises of completely free services, and now he was paying the price. Dennis had to return the $200K sales proceeds to the buyer. Adding the payments to me and Robert, the amount was considerable. Dennis asked if he could delay the compensation to me, but I couldn't agree to such a request. Later, Dennis attempted to file for bankruptcy, but Robert and I cooperated to sue him to prevent it. Now, Dennis is burdened with a huge debt and works tirelessly in physical labor day and night. Soon after, the grand piano was returned to us safely. Robert felt relieved, and made sure no one could take it again by installing a strong lock on the room where the piano was kept. And even added a security camera for good measure.
I won't let anyone touch that grand piano until I start my piano school,
said Robert, with the same spirit he had as a child, making me almost laugh. Since Robert wanted to open a piano school at the family home eventually, I decided to discuss redistributing my mother's inheritance with him. I also felt indebted to Violet for her care of my mother, and it didn't feel right for me to be the sole inheritor. Thanks to Robert's agreement with my decision, it seems we will continue to have a good relationship with his family. And then, a much-awaited baby girl was born to me. I think girls tend to cherish their mothers longer. Even though I'm a single mother, I'm fully supported by Violet, who has already finished raising her own children. I've been indebted to Violet since she helped care for my mother. Robert has also stepped up, saying he'll act as a father figure to my daughter, and his enthusiasm is evident. Additionally, my nieces, the adult daughters of my brother who are both childcare workers influenced by their piano-loving Uncle Robert. They also have started to dote on my daughter. Supported by such a warm family, I feel incredibly fortunate. With gratitude to everyone around me, I plan to live a strong life with my daughter.